whatever it takes.
Birds just keep on winning.
This is highway robbery at the center.
You gotta believe.
And he struck out this time.
Unity is adversity.
Perfect jump, and he made a perfect catch.
Refuse to lose.
Strike three swinging.
United we play. United we win.
Deep right field. Another absolute bomb over the flag court.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff. As you can see by our whiteboard, this is part 2 of our all-modern era Orioles draft. And there are not just 2 teams up here, Annie. There is a third team that was drafted by former host, friend of the program, Mr. Tim Leonard. Hello again, Tim.
Great to see you guys after a week to debrief here and really run through my draft boards. You know, I think we're all waiting on the starting pitchers and trying to figure out when those go off the board. But I'm confident in the team that I've drafted so far. I'm sure we'll run through them here in a sec. But good to be back with you guys.
Yeah, a week to debrief where we have all come back magically wearing the same clothes and in the same spots. Anyway, let's run through the rules of the draft here real quick before we get to our teams. As you mentioned here, Tim, the point of this draft was to draft the Orioles of the modern era, and we classified that as guys who have played under either Buck Showalter or Brandon Hyde. So that's 2010 to 2024. So only your numbers with the Orioles during that era will be considered. I selected Manny Machado with the first overall pick. I only get his numbers in Baltimore. I do not get his numbers in San Diego. And only your numbers from the years 2010 to 2024 will be considered, which is a little tough for Annie, who drafted Nick Markakis and does not get his few spectacular seasons before that 2010 season. And she's hoping that you forget rule number 1. She maybe is also hoping that you forget rule number 2,
clowned out here,
which is that longevity matters. We are looking at an Orioles tenure for these players, not just their best season. Of course, their best season does come into account, as Annie has drafted guys like Nelson Cruz, who only spent 1 year in a Baltimore uniform. But it was a spectacular season, so we can't clown you too much for that, Annie. But number 2, our rule there is still important. That longevity does matter. And number 3, the player must have played the position for which you are drafting him. We have 8 position players, 1 designated hitter, 4 starting pitchers. Apparently neither of any of us got that memo, because none of us have drafted a starting pitcher. We also get 2 relievers. So those are the rules of the draft. Real quick, let's run through our teams. I've made 9 selections because I forgot to not make my final of my 2 picks in last week's episode. But at first base, I've got Ryan Mountcastle, Jonathan Scope at second, third base Manny Machado, and shortstop J.J. Hardy. My 2 outfielders, Austin Hayes in center, Anthony Santander in right, Zach Britton as my first reliever. Tim, will go to your team before Annie makes the first pick of part 2 of the all-modern era Orioles draft.
Well, I started my team, Brendan, with Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman as my shortstop and catcher. Sounds familiar with the current day and age of the Orioles. Very excited about that. Cedric Mullins is my center fielder. Chris Davis at first base. Ramon Arias is currently my second baseman. And so I've got some modern day guys for sure. And then Darren O'Day is the one pitcher I've taken, a fan favorite, as my closer currently.
All right, Annie, we're giving you a hard time, but it is a solid squad here, so run us through it.
So, catchers, Matt Wieters, first baseman, Trey Mancini, third baseman, Jordan Westberg, center fielder, Adam Jones is my top pick. Nick Markakis, I'm going to defend that one till I die because it's still a 9 WAR since 2010. And DH Nelson Cruz, because it was just a fabulous 1-year season, a one-hit wonder.
It really was. It was a great season out of Nelson Cruz, and it's a good team there. I think we've got 3 pretty evenly matched teams. Of course, at the end of this, the fans are going to vote on who has the best team of the modern era Orioles between the three of us. But Annie, you are back on the clock here. Of course, this is a snake order draft, so Annie is the only participant that does not get back-to-back picks, which is a tough position to be in. But Annie, I think you've done well so far. What's your first pick here of part 2 of this draft?
So
I've had a lot of time to think. You've had a week.
So not only am I getting clowned for anti-longevity, so I'm going to make that the forefront of this pick, but also the first starting pitcher to go off the board. I'm going to go Chris Tillman. An entire career spent with the Orioles from 2010 to 2018.
Yeah, take that, longevity
Yeah,
haters.
exactly. That should make up for Nelson Cruz's 1 year with the O's. But All-Star in 2013, 4.43 overall ERA across 9 seasons, a 137 whip, and 6.7 Ks per 9 innings. Take a look at this. 1,080 innings pitched. That's the definition of longevity, isn't it?
That is the definition of longevity.
And a WAR of 8.8. So I think in terms of the starting pitcher kind of category, I think that this is somewhat of a no-brainer. I think that there's others with higher WARs but have played less for the Orioles. And I think for consistency purposes and name value, Chris Tillman is my top starting pitcher.
Yeah, and you've also got that All-Star appearance in 2013.
Right.
I think that separated Chris Tillman a little bit from the other starting pitchers on this list. And the longevity. Look at that, Annie.
Had to do it to him.
Had to do it to him. Tim, you're on the board.
Yeah, I'd love to see Annie's draft board when we started this. I'm not buying. I feel like she's tweaked now and is now favoring longevity.
Yeah.
But Chris Tillman, I mean, he was the ace of several playoff teams, so that is a good
That's
pick.
because you think that I was going to take Corbin Burns after my, which, hey, is still a good pick, but
Sure it is.
anywho.
Tim, you got 2 picks.
Yeah. Okay, I got 2 picks. I'm going to stay away from pitcher still somehow, and maybe that's questionable, but I just feel like there's a lot of pitchers that I'm looking at that I'm fine if I'm late to the pitcher game because there's not. And I want to be clear, we're talking a lot about how the starters are down here. It's the longevity point. Like Corbin Burns is still an unbelievable starting pitcher that the Orioles have had during this time period.
Yeah.
But just for this exercise of the draft, there's not a ton of pitchers that were with the Orioles for a long period of time and very consistently good. There are some. But we've just gotten to a point where there's not a huge separator between maybe tier 1 and tier 2 of pitching. So because of that, I'm still going to hold off. I'm going to actually go to Steve Pearce here, a utility guy, as my next pick. Steve Pearce did have a little bit of longevity, 5 seasons, was with the Orioles 2012 to 2016. Overall 6.9 WAR, you're getting a lot of that from his fabulous 2014 season, maybe one of the more underrated seasons in this time period. He had a 5.8 WAR in 2014 alone in 102 games. He had a 930 OPS, and I'm going to put him in left field.
Okay.
Because my next pick is going to be another utility guy who is more modern, more recent. And that is Jorge Mateo.
Okay.
Well, I think I have drafted in like every potential draft that I can select Jorge Mateo.
Now, Tim, are you going to put Jorge Mateo at second base with Ramon Urias at third and Steve Pearce in left field? Am I getting that?
Yes, because I got to put Ramon Urias at his Gold Glove position if I can. And, I guess I did have the option of putting Steve Pearce at second and putting Mateo in the outfield, but I feel like there's a little bit more familiarity between Gunnar Henderson and Jorge Mateo. So similar kind of resumes here. Jorge Mateo had a really good 2022 year, led the league in stolen bases that year. 3.6 of his total 5.5 WAR is coming over that 2022 season. So Mateo, who has been with the Orioles for a little bit, and I think gives me some positional flexibility, and Steve Pearce. I like getting guys that can play multiple different positions because then you don't run the risk of, oh, shoot, there's no more good third baseman left and we've already drafted all our teams. So I like the positional flexibility those guys give me.
Yeah, and Tim, in Jorge Mateo and Ramon Urias, you get 2 guys that kind of fall into a similar bucket where they are on a really competitive Orioles team that is now consistently making the playoffs. And while those guys are kind of utility pieces right now, I think fans tend to forget just how good those guys have been for a long stretch of time now. They are two diamonds in the rough. Ramon Urias was a waiver claim. Jorge Mateo was a waiver claim, and they turned themselves into really quality big leaguers. And so I think those are two good picks there with, again, two guys that don't have one spectacular season that jumps out. I think Jorge Mateo, you can probably point at a season or two there. Ramon Urias, obviously, with the Gold Glove in 2022. But two guys that have just been solid players here for a while.
All right.
All right, Annie.
Next up for me, okay, so you guys have pretty much filled out, well, you have filled out your infields, but I think that there is risk of using this guy or either of these people that are in my mind right now at DH for you guys. So
Okay.
I am going to go with Jonathan VR at, I think at shortstop, not
Okay.
second base. So
All right.
I'm going to go with him there. 2018 to 2019, so 2 seasons, 5.9 WAR, 216 games played, a 270, 338, 438 slash line, and a 777 OPS. I think that this guy just brings some defensive versatility that I need in my infield, and I think paired with Jordan Westburg, they'd have really good dynamic at third and shortstop.
Yeah, I think that's a good pick there, Annie. I think, as you mentioned, Tim and I had both filled out our infield, but Jonathan VR was high up on my board as a position player. So I think VR makes a lot of sense at that spot there. So I know I gave you a hard time about the whole longevity thing.
Oh, here we go.
I would prefer if you guys kind of forgot that whole argument that I
There's
just
no way
brought
I'm
up.
going to forget.
Because there is one thing for me that separated this group of starting pitchers. And Tim is smirking because he knows exactly where I'm going. And the thing for me was elite seasons. And there are two starting pitchers available that have had elite seasons. One top five, at 1/5 finish in American League Cy Young voting, 1/4 finish in American League Cy Young voting. And so with my back-to-back picks here, I am going to get the two starting pitchers that had the best single seasons as a starting pitcher in an Orioles uniform of this modern era. That's going to be Corbin Burnes and Kyle Bradish. Two top five Cy Young finishes for Burnes, of course, in 2024. He finishes 5th in American League Cy Young voting. For Kyle Bradish, the year before, in 2023, he finishes 4th in American League Cy Young voting. If you're looking at the overall WAR, I know there are guys ahead of them, but for Kyle Bradish and Corbin Burnes, I think you have the two best individual seasons of an Orioles starting pitcher during this era. And I know longevity is important, but there weren't guys like there were position players that had accumulated, several all-star appearances or anything like that. There are a few pitchers that had maybe one all-star appearance here or there. There was nobody that had the upside of a single season like Corbin Burnes and Kyle Bradish. So similar to your Nelson Cruz pick here, Annie, I get my first two starting pitchers in Corbin Burnes and Kyle Bradish and forget everything that I said about longevity.
I would like the record to show that if you were watching just this episode,
Unfortunately,
and
the
you were not
record does
watching-
show because it is recorded and put on the internet.
Okay, but if you were not watching the first episode and only watching this episode, well, you're going to have to tune into the first one when I was getting clowned for only single season one-hit wonders, a.k.a. Nelson Cruz. But alas, those are two really great starting pitchers, and your rotation so far looks really good, Brendan. So
But
I compliment you.
But alas, here we are.
Alas.
Right? It's tough that it swings that way. Tim, you're shaking your head over there. What are your thoughts?
Just a hypocritical moment for you there, Brendan.
So
I respect you a lot, and you started the podcast clowning Annie, and then you just used that and turned the table.
Yeah, I sure
I don't
did.
know. I think you could have waited on those pitchers. I wasn't going to take them as my first two off the board. I don't know about you, Annie. So it's an interesting strategy and an interesting sort of change in strategy from you.
Well, sure. I just got to keep throwing curveballs
Now we
at
know
you.
that Brendan's the type of drafter that is the devious one and tries to trick other people.
This has always been known. I don't know. I mean, Tim, you've done these drafts with me before.
Yeah.
How many times have I clowned a strategy and then just went right back to it? This is my MO
Sounds
at
like
this
a
point.
judgment of character.
Yeah,
I
I
try
would
to
say,
throw people
Annie,
off
this
their
will-
game. I mean,
Right.
I'm judging
This will
the
not be the
character.
last time, Annie.
That's
Get
okay.
used to it. I
It
think this
certainly
is
will
our
not
fourth
be.
time. He's 4 for 4. If
Yeah.
we do 20 of these, he'll be 20 for 20 on doing this.
it is not the first time. It is far from the last time. that I will do this because I'm happy with how my starting rotation looks right now.
I hope you are.
I am. Thank you. I appreciate that. I felt like that was sincere that you hoped I was, and I really am. Annie, you're back on the board.
Okay, I feel like it would be silly for me to not join the relief pitcher game because I think that there is one more that is kind of stands above the other ones, and that's Jim Johnson. So I would be bummed if one of you guys filled out your bullpen with Zach Britton and Darren O'Day and Jim Johnson. So I think I need to snag him at this pick. 2010 to 2013, a 6.8 WAR, 256 and 1/3 innings pitched, and that's a 2.77 overall ERA across those 3 seasons. All-Star in 2012, finished 7th in Cy Young in 2012, but also franchise record holder for 51 saves in a season in 2012 and then 50 the following season in 2013. Both were leading MLB at that point.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Annie. If either Tim or I had selected Jim Johnson, that is a massive advantage for our relievers. I think there are other guys that are still really solid options, but Jim Johnson definitely stands out. You mentioned the franchise record in saves for a single season. So if Tim or I paired Britton with Jim Johnson, that is a separator in this draft. Maybe just a little bit, but you avoid it with a good pick there in Jim Johnson. All right, Tim.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Annie, I was going to take him in the next round. So that was a good pick. You made a timely selection there because I think there are 3 very good relievers. And I was thinking, man, I could box Annie out of getting one of those. So, times pick there. I guess I've got back-to-back picks here. And I have not taken a starter yet. So I think it's time for me to dip into that a little bit. And, I'm going to go with the guy who's got the most WAR among starting pitchers for this draft, and that is John Means, who, of course, has been hurt a lot over his 7 seasons now in Baltimore. But when he has been healthy, 4.6 WAR per 162 games he appears in, or 162 game season. That's very solid. He had a very good 2019 year, of course, when he was named to the All-Star team. Was Rookie of the Year, 2nd place in the voting that year in 2019. He has a no-hitter in Baltimore and another fan favorite. So I'm going to go with John Means as kind of my ace, I guess. And then I'm going to go back-to-back with starting pitchers. And there are a couple different options I could go, all from a similar era of the Buck teams that have some postseason experience. And, I'm trying to win a World Series with this hypothetical team, and I want the guy who we feel most confident in giving the ball to in a postseason game, and that is Miguel Gonzalez, who was time and time again counted on in the Buck era to come through. Very good postseason pitcher, was nicknamed the Cold Killer for a reason, had that outstanding start at Yankee Stadium in Game 3 of the 2012 ALCS, 7 innings pitched, 1 run allowed. So I feel good about getting John Means, who is probably the best longevity starting pitcher, most overall WAR. And then Gonzalez is a guy that I just know I can give the ball to in a big game.
Yeah, I think those are 2 good picks there, Tim. John Means and Miguel Gonzalez were high up on my board as well. You mentioned the playoff success with Gonzalez, and of course with Means, as you mentioned. If you're just looking at an Orioles career, who racked up the most WAR and the most consistent, solid seasons, that is John Means. So I think those are 2 good selections there. We both have 2 starting pitchers. Annie has the top starting pitcher selected in Chris Tillman. Annie, you're going back to the starting pitching well or somewhere else?
I'm actually going to finish out my bullpen and go with Mount Bautista.
Okay.
I'm going with Felix Bautista just because... sure, this isn't much of a longevity topic of discussion here, but 5.2 WAR in those 2 seasons because injured all of last season, but an overall 185 ERA across those 2 seasons, a 924 WHIP, and 14.1 Ks per 9 innings. All-Star in 2023 and finished 11th in Cy Young voting in that season as well. And I think with Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista, that is a killer bullpen right there.
Yeah, I think you have solidly... Look, I think Zach Britton and Darren O'Day were the number 1 and number 2 guys in terms of relievers in this draft. I think Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista were pretty clearly number 3 and number 4. Tim, did you have the same ranking there in your relievers?
I did. I will say, I think I was going to wait personally for the next reliever. So going off the philosophy of you took Jim Johnson at the right time, I feel like there was a little bit of a drop-off tier-wise, but hey, you got the best bullpen of any of us at this point now, and I love Felix Bautista. I'm hoping he gets healthy and continues to be a dominant force back there.
Yeah, absolutely. A healthy Felix Bautista is one of the best relievers in all of baseball. So Annie finishes out her bullpen with Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista, which leaves me on the board with back-to-back picks. Now, guys, I'm looking at our position players. Tim only needs a right fielder and a designated hitter. Annie needs a second baseman and a left fielder. We all need starting pitching. And I could go with 2 starting pitchers to round out my rotation after Corbin Burnes and Kyle Bradish. And the way my board is shaking out right now, there are 2 guys remaining that I have pretty far ahead of any of the position players that I have left. I know it might be a little difficult for me to wait for Annie's next pick, to have Tim with 2 more picks. Both of you guys are going to have 2 more selections each before I make my next pick. But I kind of feel okay with picking from the position players remaining because there's not a ton of separation towards the bottom of the board. But I do have 2 starting pitchers that are higher up on my big board. And so I think I'm going to round out my starting rotation here and go back-to-back starting pitchers once again and have my first 4 selections of part 2 of our draft here be starting pitchers. That's going to be Kevin Gausman and Wei-Yin Chen. Kevin Gausman, I know, turns into an ace after he leaves the Orioles, unfortunately, in San Francisco. You know, he goes to Atlanta and Cincinnati and struggles a little bit there, figures something out in San Francisco, and then in Toronto, he has been excellent. It's not as solid of a career in Baltimore as it is in other places, but look, it's still a 4.22 ERA. It's still a lot of innings in 150 games. Kevin Gausman was still a mainstay in the Orioles rotation for those years. Wei-Yin Chen didn't have as long of a career in an Orioles uniform, only 4 seasons, but those 4 seasons were really good. A 3.72 ERA in 117 games pitched, over 700 innings. Wei-Yin Chen was a really, really solid starting pitcher for the Orioles for the time that he was there. So in Kevin Gausman and Wei-Yin Chen, I got the 2 guys on my board that were a lot higher than any of the position players remaining, and I don't have to worry about grabbing one of those starting pitchers towards the end of the board where you're going, man, it's either one season where you're pretty good or just a few seasons where you're putting up okay numbers. So with Kevin Gausman and Wei-Yin Chen, my rotation's done here, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely smart to go fill out the starting rotation there because it does kind of release the middle and upper tier of the starting pitchers, and now they're all kind of on the lower tier. I don't know if you agree with that, Tim. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of interesting. Wei-Yin Chen is basically the opposite of the Kevin Gausman discussion. Once he signed his big contract in Miami, he kind of didn't do much and had a downturn in his career. So you're getting like all the good years of him, and he's a good lefty to have in your rotation. So I think you did a smart thing there, Brendan. I probably would have done the same thing if I was you.
All right, guys, before we move on to Annie's pick, let's run through the teams here real quick. I just made 2 selections in Kevin Gausman and Wei-Yin Chen. They join my other 2 starting pitchers that I selected in this episode, Corbin Burnes and Kyle Bradish. Before him, arms-wise, I selected Zach Britton. I've got a really strong infield. With my first 3 picks, I selected Manny Machado, J.J. Hardy, and Jonathan Scope, and then I added Ryan Mountcastle to that infield later on. And in my outfield, I've got Austin Hayes and Anthony Santander. Tim, we'll go to you before Annie breaks down her team and makes her pick.
So my infield, left to right, starting at third base, is Ramon Arias. Gunnar Henderson is my shortstop. He was my top overall pick. Jorge Mateo at second base. Chris Davis and his outstanding peak years at first base. Adley Rutschman is my catcher. I am just missing right field and DH in terms of hitters right now. Steve Pearce is my current left fielder. Cedric Mullins is my speedy center fielder. And in terms of pitching, I have selected a reliever in Darren O'Day, who I feel great about, and two solid starters, John Means and Miguel Gonzalez.
And for my squad, I have Matt Wieters at catcher, Trey Mancini at first, Jordan Westberg at third, Jonathan Villar at shortstop, no one at left field, center field, Adam Jones, right field, Nelson Cruz. Starting
Nick
pitcher.
Markakis at right field.
Oh, yeah.
Nelson Cruz at DH.
Right. Nick Markakis, I can't read from this angle. Nick Markakis at right, Nelson Cruz DH. Only one starting pitcher, that's Chris Tillman. And then I've rounded out my bullpen with Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista. And for my next pick, I'm going to finish off left field with bringing in some more recent guys, someone who was second for AL Rookie of the Year in 2024. That's Colton Cowser with a 3.1 WAR, a 229, 317, 414, and 731 OPS slash line for over those last two seasons. I think that the people left for left field are other guys who have only been for 2 seasons, so longevity doesn't really matter here.
Yeah.
And I really like bringing in someone more recent and with high potential in Colton Cowser.
Yeah, fan favorite too in Colton Cowser. I think he does well on your graphic there and was spectacular last year. I think you can make an argument he should have been the AL Rookie of the Year.
Yeah.
It was a really, really good year in Baltimore, and there weren't a ton of options in the corner outfield, so I think you get a good one there. Tim, you are down one right field option. Are you going to go right field DH here or just continue to fill out your pitching staff?
Yeah, so I'm torn. That was a good pick, Annie, and I was kind of thinking about Colton Cowser myself. I guess I'll just round out my position players and DH here with back-to-back picks. I'm going to take Luke Scott as my designated hitter.
Okay.
He has a 4.1 WAR over the years that we're calculating. Remember, we're starting 2010 onwards. He missed a couple of his seasons, but you get his age 32, 33 seasons, and more importantly, you get his 2010 season, which was terrific. He had a 3.8 WAR that year, hit 27 home runs, 144 OPS plus for Luke Scott, who is now my designated hitter in 2010. So I like that pick, and now for my next one, I could go back to pitching, but I'm going to bring up a name that I was a little bit worried when Annie started in on that she was going to take. And I'm going to go for a more recent guy who's played the last 2 years in Baltimore, and Ryan O'Hearn to be my right fielder. He's had about 3 WAR over the last 2 seasons combined. I guess the only downside to this that I'm just realizing after I said his name is Chris Davis is also a lefty, so I'm not getting – we know he's a good platoon guy if we really want to get into the weeds of my roster. But I think Ryan O'Hearn is definitely worthy of a pick here and has had a nice last couple of seasons in Baltimore. So now I'm in a spot where I'm just looking for pitchers the rest of the way, and I just feel like there's less of a drop-off in pitching than there is position players.
Yeah, I think those are 2 good picks there, Tim. You round out your position players, your DH Luke Scott, your right fielder Ryan O'Hearn. I think there's kind of a mess of pitchers that you could really pick any of them there. So I think grabbing those 2 guys makes a lot of sense, and it really boxes me out because Annie has completed her outfield and DH. You have now completed your outfield and DH, and both of you guys have filled your designated hitter spot with guys that were corner outfield eligible. So I'm going to have a tough time finding a left fielder and a designated hitter when it comes back around to my pick. But Annie, you only have 1 position player vacancy at second base. You could draft a third baseman and move Jordan Westberg there or Jonathan Villar there if you drafted a shortstop if you wanted to. A lot of guys that are versatile. And you have 3 starting pitcher slots still available. So I would have to imagine that maybe you go starting pitcher here.
Yes.
Is that the thinking?
That is the thinking.
Okay.
I am going to go with another starting pitcher. I am deciding between a few. I think that there's 2 more in this remaining kind of tier that have a higher WAR than the rest of the other ones. So I am going to go with Dylan Bundy. Played in the 2012 season, but also 2016 to 2019. Sorry, not 2029. That would be wild. A 6.3 WAR, 127 games appearances, and 614 innings pitched. So almost 200 more than my other option. But a 4.67 overall ERA in those entire 5 seasons. 133 whip, and just under 9 Ks per 9 innings, which I really liked. That's kind of what stood out to me from him.
Yeah, I think that's a good pick there. Dylan Bundy, again, it kind of falls into the Kevin Gossman category of, hey, he goes to L.A. and then all of a sudden puts forth a really good season. But Dylan Bundy still had a lot of solid, good, not great seasons in Baltimore, and because of his longevity, I think it makes it a good pick there as your second starting pitcher. All right, guys. Annie, you only have a hole at second base. Tim, your position players are filled. So I don't need to rush for a catcher because my catcher that I'm going to be selecting is not going to be playing second base for you, Annie. I would dispute that.
Probably wasn't on any of our draft boards after the 200.
No, I think after Wieters and Rutschman were selected, you guys weren't going to be looking at the catcher I will most likely be selecting. At DH, I don't think I'm in a rush either. Left fielder, I probably need to select here because the left fielder that I am looking at is a classic utility player and a fan favorite as well that could have played second base for you, so I'm going to make sure that he doesn't play second base for you and plays left field for me, and that's Ryan Flaherty. 452 games in an Orioles uniform. It's only a 2.3 WAR. It's not fantastic stats out of Flaherty, but the dude played everywhere on the diamond. I had him as second base, third base, shortstop, left field, and right field eligible on our draft boards here. So Ryan Flaherty was the guy I had as just going, you know what? If all else fails, Ryan Flaherty I can pick and put him somewhere. And that is what he did for the Orioles. You could just place him into the lineup wherever you needed him, and Ryan Flaherty would play that position, and he would probably play it well defensively. He was just that kind of player. So Ryan Flaherty is going to slot in for me at left field. I'm not going to rush for a designated hitter. I don't think I need to yet at this point. The one position that I know is going to be gone by the time the picks get back around to me, because Tim will select one of them.
Is catcher? No, I'm kidding.
Is catcher, yeah. Is relief pitcher. And so there aren't a lot of separators here for me with relievers, but if I am going with the philosophy of one outstanding season, as I went with Corbin Burns and Kyle Bradish, then there is one reliever that jumps out a little bit, and that is Yennier Cano, an all-star in the 2023 season. Oh, Tim, you thought I was going in a different direction after I had that.
I had another guy in mind, I thought you were going and stealing my pick.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going with the all-star in the 2023 season. Yennier Cano hasn't racked up a lot of saves in an Orioles uniform. It's not the Britton or Johnson or Felix Darren O'Day was more of a setup guy, but Britton, Johnson, and Felix racked up a lot of saves. Yennier Cano didn't go that way. I know which other guy I could have selected, and I'm just realizing that I missed him. I'm just realizing that I missed him on my board, and I can't have takebacks because I already did a whole thing about it. Tim's not allowing it. I know. I missed him on my board. That's my fault. This is my karma for making fun of Annie and then talking about the longevity picks. I probably should have selected Brad Brock, and he's going to be on Tim's team, but now I have Yennier Cano, and it's fine, Tim.
Yeah, it's fine for me. Works out great for me. I would have allowed a take back there because, things are moving quickly. We're all trying to figure out our big boards here as we go. But, yeah, you really teed it up for Brad Brock in his 2016 All-Star season. So
yeah, I know I did. All right. We don't need to talk about it, Annie. You're on the board.
Okay. My next one. Okay. So instead of rounding out my lineup, I'm going to go with another starting pitcher because you guys are pretty much done with lineups. And I am going to go with the next highest WAR on my board in Jeremy Guthrie, even though that was 2 seasons, still an ERA of 4.08, 5.4 Ks per 9 inning, and a 12.50 whip. He was really good in 2007, 2008, but cannot count those, unfortunately. But still a 6.2 WAR in that 2010-2011 season. And I think that he works really well with Dylan Bundy and Chris Tillman in my starting rotation.
Yeah, it's two really good seasons from Jeremy Guthrie. And you mentioned not getting the seasons before. That's a little bit of a bummer based on the parameters of this draft being 2010 to present, but it's still two good seasons out of Jeremy Guthrie. And I would imagine he would have been Tim's third starting pitcher had you not selected him.
Yes, I think gloating your mistake with not taking Brad Brock backfired because I was thinking about Jeremy Guthrie, and I'm kind of disappointed that is where Annie went there. I know we missed out on some of his good years, but Guthrie was just a really good pitcher on, unfortunately, a lot of Orioles teams that didn't win a lot, but he was a pretty trustworthy guy. So I do have to go for pitching for sure, and Brad Brock is the best player available, but because you guys have already selected and filled out your bullpens, the draft was always going to work out this way that a really good reliever was probably going to be the last pick of the draft for one of us because there are an outstanding crop of relievers. So I'm going to hold off on that. There's no need to pick Brad Brock because you guys cannot take him. So I'm going to go round out my starting rotation with back-to-back picks. I'm going to take Dean Kramer, who I'm sure Annie was kind of contemplating there. I'm guessing he has a 4.3 WAR over now 5 seasons in Baltimore from 2020 onward. Has had some ups and downs, maybe a little bit, but generally speaking, he's been a pretty reliable starting pitcher throughout this recent era for the Orioles. So Dean Kramer will be one of my starters. And then the second starting pitcher back-to-back here, my last starter, I could go many different directions. And you guys are probably going to get on me for this, but I think I just got to go Grayson Rodriguez just to have Gunnar, Adley, Grayson all on my team. It's just, I know that's more of a future pick, and the exercise of this is we're factoring what have you done production-wise to this point. And Grayson overall has just been bothered by injuries, of course. He's been fine to this point. I think we're all expecting him to continue to progress in his career, but he's in kind of that next tier with a couple different options. I could have gone Tyler Wells. He's the best WAR available as starting pitchers. But, yeah, it's a sexy name choice of Grayson Rodriguez that I can't turn down.
Yeah, look, I mean, I know that we could clown you for this. He's the next starting pitcher that I had on my board. It's 2 good seasons from Grayson Rodriguez, and there is certainly more to come, which doesn't factor into this draft, as you mentioned, but you can't hate the team chemistry there with Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, and Grayson Rodriguez, the 3 maybe big cornerstones of the Orioles' success in the future. So, Annie, you've got 2 positions remaining, second base and starting pitcher. I'm not going to select a second baseman, unless, well, I guess I could as my designated hitter, but I am certainly not going to select a starting pitcher. So it would probably behoove you to go with a position player here, since there is no risk of me selecting a starting pitcher that you would draft on the way back around. So which position player are you going to go with as your second baseman? So
speaking of kind of best WAR available for that position, second base, I'm going to go with Hanser Alberto. 2019 to 2020 seasons, a 4.1 WAR, so it does get pretty thin at second base after, the Jorge Mateos and the Jordan Westburg. I mean, probably could have used him at second base, but Hanser Alberto is the next best option. So 193 games, 781 plate appearances, 299, 322, 413 slash line with a 735 OPS, 15 home runs in those 2 seasons, and 73 RBIs. I just think it's kind of the last best option, to be honest.
Yep, I think that was the correct pick. I mean, look, a left-handed starting pitcher hated to see Hanser Alberto step into the box during that 2019 season. Hit 398 against lefties. Platoon legend, Hanser Alberto. So you round out your lineup. You only have 1 starting pitcher to go. Tim has just 1 relief pitcher to go, and I am the only one that has to fill out my lineup. I've got a hole at catcher, and I've got a hole at designated hitter. I think the hole at catcher is an obvious one to fill, and that's Caleb Joseph. 400 games, a 4.5 WAR, just a 623 OPS, but Caleb Joseph was really the epitome of a good veteran leader in this Orioles clubhouse. He was just a solid backup catcher for a while, and Caleb Joseph is, I think, the obvious selection here just because of the longevity in games. Again, over 400 games played. The offensive numbers don't jump off the page, but he was also a really good defensive catcher as well. So, look, as soon as you guys went with Adley Rutschman and Matt Wieters, I knew that I was going to be left with Caleb Joseph, but I think there are worse options to have than a guy who just gave you really, really solid defense and decent enough offensive numbers to be just a solid catching option there. So Caleb Joseph is going to be my catcher. And then with my last pick, I need a designated hitter. You guys know who was a really good designated hitter in Baltimore for a few seasons from 2016 to 2019? Mark Trumbo.
Yeah.
How about that 2016 season for Mark Trumbo? I know the WAR doesn't jump off the page for him because, well, he didn't play very good defense, if he played defense at all. But during that 2016 season, we're talking about a 256 batting average, an 850 OPS, an all-star appearance, a silver slugger, and a league-leading 47 home runs. Andy, I know you took Nelson Cruz early because of that fantastic all-star season. I don't think Mark Trumbo is all that far off. I know the cumulative WAR from his time from 2016 to 2019 doesn't jump off the page, but in his Oriole career, it's still a 765 OPS, highlighted by that all-star season in 2016. So I feel really good here with my last pick, the last position player selected as a guy with an all-star season who, in an Orioles uniform, led all of baseball in home runs in a single season with 47 in 2016.
Yeah, Mark Trumbo was on my board as well for designated hitter. The 1.7 WAR seems really low for him and for that season, like you mentioned, in 2016. The other one on my board for designated hitter as well was Delman Young, just because of that postseason run and that 2014 ALDS game against the Tigers. But luckily I didn't have to go that far to do that. But I guess with my last pick, up to starting pitcher, I am very tempted where if longevity was not part of this and you could look into the future that it would be Zach Eflin, but I don't think that is the point of
you would only get half
game.
A season of Zach Eflin.
Exactly. So I'm going to go with Tyler Wells. I assume that is the pretty much only one available that you guys would consider as well. So 2021 to 2024 seasons, dealt with some injury, which is too bad, but still a 3.3 WAR and 4.06 overall ERA across those 4 seasons that he did play and was healthy, and an 8.3 Ks per 9 inning, and just over 1,000 WHIP when he's healthy and his full potential.
Yeah, I think Tyler Wells was the best starting pitcher that I had available. Tyler Wells has bounced between the starting rotation and the bullpen. I think Jason Hamill was also a name that you can consider there. Those are really the only starting pitchers that I had left. Tim, I imagine Tyler Wells was the best starter left on your board as well.
Yeah, that was the one I was considering. It was really down to Wells or Grayson Rodriguez. So I like what I did because Rodriguez is just a little more of a flashy name, but Tyler Wells has been good, and I think that's a solid option there.
All right, Tim, you have the last pick of the draft. I'm just going to write in the name. We have been laughing about it since I
can't believe this guy fell to me. Brendan.
We have been laughing about it since I read my big board wrong and drafted Yennier Cano over Brad Brock, who has also just won All-Star appearance, but has accumulated more WAR than Yennier Cano. I'm well aware. I'm going to start writing down the name before you even say the pick. But Tim, you have the honors of the final selection and making fun of me.
Yeah, it's just I think the newspaper tabloids in Baltimore are going to be all over you for whiffing on this. The things were just moving too quickly for you, I guess. But I got to go with Brad Brock, who, by the way, in the final pick of the draft here, has the 30th best WAR of everyone available. I think we've now made 45 selections, if I can do math. So pretty good value here for Brad Brock in his 2016 All-Star season, like you mentioned. He was part of that mass exodus in 2018 when the trade deadline happened, but, you know, had a very solid career there for the Orioles. So very excited to get him to round out my roster and just thanking my lucky stars that someone forgot about him.
Yeah, sure. Tim, I mean, look, there are some good relievers that weren't selected either. I mean, Michael Givens racked up 6.5 career WAR in an Orioles uniform, and he isn't even selected because there are a bunch of good relievers that came off the board. But if you're following along with us live here on YouTube and Facebook, you can see that our whiteboard is complete. We have just drafted 3 modern era Orioles teams. Let's break them down. Tim, you made the final selection. Give us the breakdown of your team.
All right. So I started out as the third overall pick. In part one of our podcast, I took Gunnar Henderson. Adley Rutschman was my next pick, back-to-back 3 and 4. So started out with a bang, good chemistry at short and catcher. Cedric Mullins is my center fielder. He's in the corner outfield surrounded by Steve Pearce in left field, who had a sneaky, very good 2015 year for the Orioles. And Ryan O'Hearn is in right field for me. Ramon Arias at third base. Chris Davis at first base. I got Jorge Mateo at second base. Some utility options there with Pierce, Mateo, and Arias. And my DH is Luke Scott, who is an outstanding DH to have and will hit some dingers for me. My pitchers, John Means, Miguel Gonzalez, Dean Kramer, and Grayson Rodriguez. And then my relief pitchers, Darren O'Day and Brad Brock, of course. So I got with that last pick. So kind of a modern team for me. I went with a lot of Hyde guys, I will say. My relief pitchers are from that era where there were a ton of very good relievers for the Orioles. But I've got a lot of guys that have some familiarity together and a lot of young talent from kind of the Hyde era.
Well, Tim, I think it's a really good team. I think your relievers, it's probably the best combination of two with the high upside of Darren O'Day and then, of course, somehow getting Brad Brock with the last pick in the draft. We don't know how that happened, but it's a really solid team there. It's not as good as my team, but that's okay. Annie, tell us about your team.
Okay, let's see if I can read it this time. Okay, we have I made a few surprises to you guys in terms of order of the picks that went, but I'm happy with it. I have Matt Wieters at catcher, Trey Mancini at first, Hanser Alberto at second, Jordan Westberg third, Jonathan Villar at shortstop, Colton Cowser left field, Adam Jones as my top pick at center field, Nick Markakis at right field, Nelson Cruz designated hitter, and then starting pitchers Chris Tillman, Dylan Bundy, Jeremy Guthrie, and Tyler Wells. And relievers, Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista.
Yeah, as we mentioned, Danny, I think you've got probably the third and fourth best relievers in Jim Johnson and Felix Bautista. I think you can make an argument that that might be the best bullpen as well, right along there with Tim's. You've got a few guys that had really spectacular seasons. Nelson Cruz, just 1 year in an Orioles uniform, but made an all-star game. Jordan Westberg, not a lot of seasons under his belt, but was an all-star last season. Colton Cowser finished second in AL Rookie of the Year voting last year, which is funny because your first pick with the second overall pick was Adam Jones, who has played close to 1,300 games in an Orioles uniform in this draft, which this draft's parameters, of course, being from 2010 to 2024. If you have played under Buck Showalter or Brandon Hyde, you were eligible to be selected. My team, I'm going to break that down there. With my first overall pick at third base, I took Manny Machado. I followed that up with two of his infield mates, Jonathan Scope at second, J.J. Hardy at shortstop. Rest of my infield, Caleb Joseph at catcher, Ryan Mountcastle at first base. In my outfield, I've got the super utility man, Ryan Flaherty in left field, Austin Hayes in center, and Anthony Santander in right, with Mark Trumbo rounding out the lineup as my designated hitter. I started out this episode by drafting 4 consecutive starting pitchers. I went with Corbin Burns, Kyle Bradish, Kevin Gossman, and Wei-Yin Chen. And then in my bullpen, I've got Zach Britton and Yennier Cano. Guys, I think we drafted three pretty even teams here because there are certainly strengths to all of them. Annie, I think your outfield stands out with Adam Jones, Nick Markakis, and Colton Cowser. I think you can put Nelson Cruz into that conversation as well.
That would be designated
so fun to hitter.
See.
Yeah, that would be a heck of an outfield. Yeah. I think my infield maybe stands out a little bit, especially up the middle. Jonathan Scope, Manny Machado, J.J. Hardy. And then I went with 4 starting pitchers pretty early here. Corbin Burns, Kyle Bradish, Kevin Gossman, Wei-Yin Chen. And then Tim, I mean, the bullpen, outstanding Darren O'Day and Brad Brock. And I think it's a really solid, well-rounded lineup here with Adley Rutschman, Chris Davis, Gunnar Henderson, Cedric Mullins. That's a lot of guys who can put bat on baseball. Tim, how are you feeling about your team?
Yeah, I feel good. I got to say, as you read your pitchers, that is a pretty stout starting pitching group, plus your bullpen. So not to just go out of my way to give your team credit, but it's fascinating. Every time we do this, sure. Every time we do this, we talk a lot about the social media graphic we're going to put out, and everyone's going to vote on it. And, I just feel like pitchers don't ever really pop on that graphic. So I would encourage people to take a look at the full roster here. If you're listening and then you're going to vote, And also keep in mind, like, some people are wondering, why didn't we draft Brian Roberts? Well, he only really had one good season. It was the tail end of his career in Baltimore. Remember, it's 2010 is the starting point. So Nick Markakis is 2010 onward, and Jeremy Guthrie's 2010 onward. And that's why some of these guys fell down the board.
Yeah.
Don't remind them of that, Tim.
Yeah, well, I do think Annie's team is looking pretty good from a social media perspective. And I think we just have even teams in general. It fell that way.
Yeah, Annie, we're not accusing you of
It's
pandering.
okay.
I just am pointing out that along with the 3 teams that we will make on the graphic and put on social media, we will also be posting the rules. So I'm putting that out there. So people will be able to see that, hey, we're only counting 2010 from 2024, but maybe they'll just see Nick Markakis and go, oh, man, that's Nick Markakis.
Do we do combined totals of WAR for each team?
We could. I don't know if
Just
we
so
have
we-
in the past.
Just so we know. We
Yeah.
don't have to post it, but
I mean,
just
we
so
could
know.
do maybe combined wars, combined all-star games
Yeah,
kind
that'd
of
be
thing.
cool.
I think that would make a lot of sense. But of course, we are not deciding who has the best teams. That would be you, the fans, who have hopefully listened to these 2 episodes of The Bird's Nest. You have heard the breakdown of our teams, where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are, and you get to decide who has built the best Orioles team of the modern era. But this is a really fun exercise. It always reminds me of just how many good players have been on the Orioles over the past, now 14 years. We're only talking about 2 managers here, in
Yeah.
Buck Showalter and Brandon Hyde. So there are a lot of good players that have worn an Orioles uniform over the last 14 years or so, and the Orioles are back to winning. I mean, there's even a rebuild phase in here. You could argue,
Multiple.
kind of you could
Yeah.
probably argue multiple here, but the Orioles have still found diamonds in the rough during those rebuild phases and have now had a lot of high-end talent, both in those later 2010s teams that were making a push, and now as the Orioles continue to make a push as we enter the 2025 season. But guys, this is a really fun exercise. This is my favorite episode of the offseason, one of my favorite episodes of the year. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have you back here next year for your next draft.
Yeah, I was going to say, it is my favorite episode of the year because it's the only episode I'm on anymore. So it's always good to be back and doing a MASN podcast with you guys. Always fun. So I appreciate you having me, as always.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. Always a pleasure to have you back. So big thank you to Tim Leonard. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes for producing this one. We hope you followed along with us live on Facebook and YouTube, as we are live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on those 2 platforms. Or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest. Make sure you listen to this episode, to the episode from last week where we had part 1 of the draft, and then head over to our Twitter and Facebook pages and vote for which team you think is the best between myself, Annie Klaff, and Tim Leonard. But for Tim and Annie, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.